good morning, and I've been asked to share a few thoughts in the first few slides about recruitment, and then also I've got a few thoughts about then motivating and retaining people once you get them. Now, I know, having talked to people this morning, that we have some very keen job hunters as well as employers here today, so I might be just a little bit cheeky and in my first few slides give a few pointers for our job hunters who've joined us as well, because the same kind of rules and techniques apply, just the other way around. The first thing I just wanted to touch on was the legislation that's around recruitment. So a lot of people are aware of the legislation requirements once you take somebody on, once they've been with you for a particular period of time, but there's also legislation that applies during your recruitment process. And in particular, things like the Equality Act, which is fairly new, but has brought together all the various pieces of discrimination legislation that we had under one big umbrella. So instead of having lots of various bits of legislation, we now have 6 protected characteristics. So sex, race, disability, age, sexual orientation, and religion and philosophical belief are the 6 protected characteristics. And because somebody has unfair dismissal rights in respect of discrimination from the beginning of the recruitment process, they don't even have to have worked a day for you, it's something that you need to be very familiar with when you're drafting adverts, when you're putting job specs together, when you're recruiting people, interviewing people into the business. So in everything that you do, in that recruitment practice and procedure that you have, you should be ensuring that it's not discriminatory in any particular way. If you have a genuine occupational need for somebody to speak a certain language, or to be male or to be female, then that's fine, but it's got to be absolutely a genuine occupational need for that particular role. There are also some other interesting bits of legislation around, but particular things like rehabilitation of offenders. So if you receive a CV, or if during the process of an interview it becomes obvious that somebody has served some time in prison, for example, there are special rules around the rehabilitation of offenders, and it's something worth getting some advice on. Oops, I don't want to spend too much time on the law, but instead I just wanted to quickly share our sort of 8 steps in terms of when we go in and we have a look at what clients are doing in recruitment and how they might improve that. There are really 8 things that we look at, and I thought I'd take you briefly through those this morning. This step often gets missed, so really the first question you should be asking, either if somebody leaves or if you identify some skill gap and so on in the organisation, is whether you really got the need to recruit at all, particularly in these times. It's worth taking a moment to see whether you actually need to recruit, and in particular whether you need to recruit like for like. So what we often see is the business changes, or the market changes, or the skill needs of the business change, and actually when somebody leaves you, it's a good opportunity to reassess what are the skill needs or the knowledge needs or the needs because your business has changed or your customers have changed, and it's a good opportunity to think about bringing those new skills into the organisation rather than cloning, repeating, having another one of the person who's just left. Doesn't mean they haven't done a great job for you, but it is an opportunity to pause and think about, do we need to replace them? And if we do need to replace them, how do we do that? Are there new skills or new experience we need to bring into the organisation? We've already had a couple of comments this morning about IT experience, the use of web, the use of web-based marketing and so on. These are becoming issues for more and more businesses, the kind of skills that might not be in your business right now, but the sorts of things that you might need going forward. You might also have an opportunity to change the role, to change which team it sits in, to change the responsibilities and the accountabilities of the role to the benefit of the business. So with the existing employee, maybe they weren't keen on doing something, or they weren't very skilled in a particular area. Again, here's your opportunity to change the way that this employee, this role could act within your business. So don't just recruit like for like, think about it. Take some time out to think, what is it really you need to bring into the organisation, and particularly these times of very tight budgets, it's worth spending some time having a look at that. So really, I'm going to talk about competencies a little bit in a moment, but the other big thing is to really clearly, specifically decide exactly what it is that you want. So we read a lot of job descriptions and job adverts, and it's actually not that clear what you want. What are the specific skills or the specific experience that somebody needs to bring into that role or into the organisation? And so what we often find is you do a day of interviewing with somebody, we see 8 wonderful people, your brain turns to jelly because you've sat there all day long interviewing somebody, and at the end of the day the manager can't make a decision on whether it should be candidate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8. And one of the big problems, one of the reasons they can't make that decision, is they haven't put enough thought and actually written down specifically what they need. So a general job description, a general advert's not really enough. You need to be really, really clear. One of the traps that employers are still falling into, for example, so I mentioned the Equality Act, one of the protected characteristics is age. We still see a lot of adverts that say we need 5 years experience of X, and obviously more years implies that candidates need to be older, and so you're risking potentially age discrimination by describing things in that way. So you need to say instead what it is you need experience doing. So if it's a project role, you need somebody with experience of running 1 million plus projects, or running multi-projects all at one place. So rather than going for a number of years experience, you need to say very specifically what you want, and that will maximise the chances that once you've seen the candidates, you might be able to find somebody and pick somebody positively who's got those specific skills. I mentioned competencies. We use this a lot, these kinds of methods, and the reason we do is organisations tend to be, on the whole, better at talking about the knowledge and skills that they need somebody to have, or at least training those knowledge and skills when they take somebody new into the organisation. But actually, if you think about the last problem employee that you had, it tends not to be the knowledge and skills that end up being the reason why you dismiss them. It tends to be the behaviour that they exhibited inside your organisation. Sometimes the code word for that is attitude. So we get a lot of clients who talk about having the wrong attitude. Somebody's got the wrong attitude to be in this business. But really what they're talking about are the behaviours that are critical for success in a particular role. And there's no one size fits all. A different business in a different sector will need a different set of behaviours from people in the roles in order to be successful at what they do, and for the business to be successful at what they do. But we use these kinds of models, and there are some that you've probably seen, competencies that go on for page after page, but actually there are some quick ways, and the modelling that we do, of generating some information on this. And again, I'll show you later on how it can be quite useful in an interview situation as well. So you're not just looking for knowledge, you're not just looking for particular skills, you're looking for what we used to call in HR many years ago, best fit. You're looking for somebody that's got the knowledge and the skills and the experience, but also how they do it, the way they do it, their behaviours will make a big difference. So if you're into customer service, it's not enough to know how to do the thing on the computer that solves the customer's problem. It's actually the way in which somebody interacts with that customer that I almost said problem customer, with that customer that makes the difference between an organisation that's seen as good at solving customer issues or good at customer service and those are not. A really simple experience of that, just the other day I went into Halfords to get something. I went to Pets at Home first for my new dog to get them something, and the great thing about Pets at Home is they say hello when you come in. Remember that? You used to get somebody say hello when you went into a shop. So they actually say hello to you, and as you go out, if you go out with nothing, they say, couldn't you find what you wanted today? Now anybody can write that script, but the trick is getting people to do it, getting people who want to do it. And that makes a big difference on your impression of the shop. I went out of Pets at Home and into Halfords, and the person on the till didn't even make eye contact. They didn't even grunt at me. I didn't find what I wanted. Nobody approached me and said, and they must have been in the shop somewhere, but I didn't find it, and I walked out, and they didn't get a sale. And that's what I mean about the competence, the behaviour. It's not enough to know how to do it or to have the experience. It's about, if you want your organisation to be really successful, it's how people do that stuff that you do that sets you out from the competition. And recruitment is an ideal time to get somebody into your organisation who has, for want of a better phrase, the right attitude, but in effect has the right behaviours, the desire to do it in the right way. This was in here really just to say it's incredibly complicated getting competencies out because they impact on so many things, but as I said, there are some handy, nifty ways of shortcutting that process. You're probably all familiar really with the various ways of sourcing candidates. There's nothing particularly new. I suppose the internet has been the biggest area of growth, and it can be useful, but the biggest problem with the internet as a recruiter, and even for those of you who are job hunting, is you will be one of millions in the response, and that's the big problem with advertising on the internet, is you just get absolutely inundated with response. So it might look a cheaper option than advertising in the right trade magazine or asking an agency to do some work for you, but you will spend a lot of time sifting through the results. And for those of you that are the job hunters here, if you're going to apply by internet, you need to do something a bit different on that CV, because you will spend literally seconds looking at it to get through the massive response that they have from all over the world for the one vacancy that they put on read.co or wherever they've put it. So think about where you source candidates from. Word of mouth is still quite a good way of doing it. You need to be a little bit careful, again, that you don't just clone, having the same people over and over again, repeating the same mistakes. But there's still some real value in word of mouth, still some real value in trade publications, in the local and national press, these kinds of places. As I said earlier on, be a little bit careful how you draft the advert, but particularly saying something about your company is really quite important, something positive about your company. And then what I often find, I've been doing some work for an IT company recently, and what the big problem was, they wanted people to do implementation, but everybody wants to be a developer. That's what everybody wants to do. And so their big problem was they weren't thinking about that when they were drafting the adverts. And so we were getting applications for these implementation roles and coding roles were actually all from people who think, oh, that's a nice IT company, I could go along and be a developer. And so the way we got around that was we changed the advert, the requirements end of that advert, to spell out really clearly what the career path is for people in implementation, because there was one. It was just very different from being a developer. And that's changed, not completely, but to quite a large extent, that changed the kind of people who are now applying for the role, because by spelling out the real requirements and adding something in there about career path, A, we're sending out a great message that you have got a career with us, right? Because in these times that's difficult. But B, we're spelling out what that is So we're getting the right people applying for the job instead of being inundated with people who are applying for that job because they think it's a way to become a developer in 12 months' time when they just don't have the capacity for that kind of transition. So watch your adverts, think about what you're saying in your advert, and are you really wording them in a way that is attractive to the kinds of person that you want to recruit into the organisation. CVs are still used an awful lot. You may use application forms, but CVs, in my experience, is still the biggest way of doing it. Somebody made a comment earlier on about the sort of standard of spelling and all those kinds of things, and we see awful problems like that. The worst one I ever had was where it came in this envelope, and as they glued the envelope down, they kind of glued the top of the accompanying letter into the envelope. So as you open the envelope, it ripped the accompanying letter with it, and of course, you know, your impression of somebody who sent you that is that they were probably not that serious about getting the job. And these things have an amazing impact on recruiters. If it looks messy, if page one doesn't say anything about you and about what you can do for this organisation and the experience that you've got, within that 30 seconds you've lost their interest. So it's still out there, it's still valuable as a CV. But again, for the employers among us, we need to use the CV to compare it with the specifics of what we're looking for and be fairly ruthless and see, have they said in the CV any of the things that we're looking for, to try and narrow down the number of people that we see in the interview process. Okay. So just thinking about the interview, it's usually something that isn't very planned, but it does need to be planned. You need to be very up on what the vacancy is, and again on the requirements of the job. You need to have planned out some headline questions on the various things that you're looking for, and to apply those pretty consistently across the number of candidates that you're going to see, so you don't have problems of asking different people different things. You want to be relatively consistent, pretty much only at that headline level, because different people will have different experience, different answers to the questions, and so it's hard to plan your follow-up questions, but you want to make sure that in the 30, 40, 50 minutes, whatever it is that you allocate for an interview, that you cover those key specifics that you're looking for, that you have some headline questions so you consistently ask people the same things and cover the same ground, even if the follow-up is different because their experience is different. Do try, and the worst interview I ever had, I remember going for an interview, I was in hotels many years ago, it was quite a posh hotel in London, they didn't take me on, but this general manager sat there on this rather plush oak desk, opening his mail while he interviewed me, and he quite clearly put the wrong CV on his desk, because all the questions about my past experience were not about my experience but about somebody else's, and obviously these days I would probably walk up and get up and walk out, but in those days I was much more keen to get the jobs, and so I sat through this terrible interview, and it has a massive impact on people who come to your organisations for a job. And although you may think it's a kind of one-way process, we do quite a lot of outplacement work, and one of the questions I ask candidates when they come back from interviews is, what was your impression of that organisation? And it's amazing the amount of impression that they get from just being with you for an hour in an interview. How your reception is, what did it sound really stressful out in the office, and the interview itself gives people a lot of clues about what it's going to be like to work there. So it really is a two-way process. You need to pay a lot of attention, and you need to make sure that you listen to what people have got to say, and you ask relevant follow-up questions. There are all kinds of ways of doing interviews. I'll share with you a little bit of research on interviews in a second. One-to-one interviews are still the most common way of doing it. where there are either lots of vacancies or lots of applicants, we often we script a telephone screening interview, and that can be quite a good way of doing it. Particularly, actually, it's amazing the number of people who take on people to do jobs where most of the contact with the client will be on the phone, and they never listen to them on the phone before they actually take them on. So telephone interviews can have a place. Panel interviews are fairly rare, I would say, in private industry, much more likely in public sector. They can be useful. Again, we'll have a look at the research on that. But the thing with panel interviews is to, again, quite strictly assign to the people on the panel the areas that they're going to cover. Otherwise, what happens is people tend to end up cutting across each other, and it gets a bit messy. So interviews are really useful. They're very common in terms of the way that we recruit in this country. However, there's an interesting bit of research that was done quite some time ago, and it looked at the ability of interviews to predict performance in the role. So if you're a company that primarily recruits by interview, they went along and they looked at the candidates that these people took on, and then they went back in 12 months' time and had a look at how well decisions out of interviews predicted how well somebody would do in the job. And actually what they found was that for most interviews, you might as well just pick a CV out of a hat and take them on, because that was about as good as it got. So fairly random prediction, in other words. The way that you get better and make better decisions in interviews is to structure them, is to be really clear about what you're looking for, to have some structure to them so that you ask questions about the things that are really going to make a difference in the role, and to think about roles where you might want to put in some other things. So we do some recruitment where we will use some psychometric testing, for example, and personality assessment. That can be quite useful. It's not a substitute for a good interview or for meeting somebody, but it can be quite useful on the behavioural side to see how somebody would fit inside an organisation. And I quite often use it with a manager, and we'll get the test results and I'll sit down and say, knowing how you manage, if you were to take on this person, given where their profile sits, these might be some of the issues that you have. And it can be quite a good way of ironing out some of those things before you make a horrendous mistake and take on somebody else. Another thing that we run as well and do some work on from time to time is assessment centres. So combining an interview, maybe with a personality test, with some other kinds of exercises which are relevant to the role that somebody's going to do for your business. And it just gives you a little bit of insight, again, if carefully crafted, into how that person might do in a particular role. So think your interviews are fine, structure them really well, however, so that you don't just rely on a rush, a dash into the interview room and are in effect picking a name out of a hat. To structure them well and think about other things that you could do. So one of the other things, for example, in this IT company is we created a technical test, and now everybody has to go through the technical test and pass at a certain level before they get interviewed. So we're again we're minimising the amount of time a manager has to put into recruitment, and we're maximising the likelihood that we're seeing the right kind of candidate. And although it takes a bit of effort to get the test for the first candidate, you're then repeating the test over and over again. So you're getting good value out of some of those things. We get asked a lot about appropriate questions. The big issue with interviews is that, certainly in this country, we tend to ask a lot of hypothetical questions. So if I gave you this job, what would you do? If you had a horrendous client on the end of the phone, how would you resolve it? And the big problem with that is that somebody can answer anything they like to that. They can probably predict what the answer is that you would like. but you will never know for sure whether that's what they would actually do. And so the beauty of the competency and behavioural route is that you can go and craft questions about people's actual past experience, and either competency-based, or you might have heard critical incident technique or episodic interviewing. They all do the same thing. What they do is they focus the candidate on telling you something about the past, and if you believe that past behaviour is a good predictor of future behaviour, you can draw some conclusions about how they might operate inside your business. So for those of you who are the keen job hunters here, if somebody asks you a hypothetical question, my top tip is to say, well, let me tell you about this time in the past when I actually did it, and give a real example of something you've done. And the benefits of the real example are that it'll be personal to you. It might even be quite an amusing story, so people will remember you. And for us who are recruiting, remembering which out of the 8 candidates or the 20 candidates is a great one. It's quite a hard job. And you also, as an interviewer, get lots of different information because everybody's experience is different. Whereas if you ask hypothetical questions, everybody tends to kind of say the same thing. So it's not something I can teach in an hour, but here's a little clue as to how it works. So if you close your eyes and I say to you, think of the worst boss that you ever had. If you had one, you'll start to think about them. And if I say, think of your favourite pet as a child, what was that pet? What was the favourite game that you liked to play with that pet? If you had one, if you had a favourite pet, you'll start to think about your favourite pet. And the reason is that our brain kind of stores the highs and lows of our experience, and we can tap into that in an interview. So we can say, what was the most difficult project that you ever delivered on time? And instead of getting a hypothetical example about how I would run a project, what you get is a real experience of delivering a difficult project on time. And you get much better information that way than you do out of asking hypothetical questions. For the recruiters among us, you just have to be a little bit careful. So the classic one for me was, I said to somebody once, what was the best decision you ever made? Note, I didn't say work decision, the best decision you ever made. And she said to me, dumping my husband. Now obviously you might not want to stray, it's not very appropriate for an interview, so you have to be a little bit careful. It's a very powerful technique. You need to focus on work. Or if you're talking to somebody that doesn't have much work experience, you can focus on school or college or voluntary stuff that they've done. So you can focus the questions really accurately by using these behavioural approaches, by ditching hypothetical questions and getting candidates to talk about their real experience. And as I say, for the candidates among you, talk about your real experience, because that's what sets you apart from every other candidate in the room. So think about, prep your questions and think about, am I somebody who uses hypothetical questions? How could I craft those questions better so I get real information out of the interview process? Just a couple of things to watch out when assessing the evidence. So there's this thing called the horns and halo effect. So if the person in front of you likes the same football team, went to the same college, reads the same newspaper, whatever it might be, as interviewers we're a bit nervous about doing interviews typically, and you look for anything that kind of links you with that candidate, and you have a warm glow and a good feeling about somebody with whom you share something else, and it probably has absolutely no relevance whatsoever to the job, but you feel good about them because there's some link there. And we ask, don't we, when we start interviews, we kind of ask these sort of very warm, fuzzy questions, and that's often where you get some of that information. So you think, well, they must be all right because they went to the same college that I did. And even if you don't kind of consciously think it's what's coming across. Typically, on the other end of that, if they support your arch rival football team, or they come from somewhere you don't like, or whatever it might be, you have some negative reaction to something that they've done or said, or whatever it might be, you get this cloven hoof or this horns effect, where you almost don't know quite why, but you don't think that person's going to be right for you, or right for the team, or right for the organisation. So you have to be quite careful about that. The other thing you get, the other kind of responses you have, so I remember many years ago interviewing somebody who came for an interview and he had no socks on. So I sort of spent the whole interview thinking, I wonder why he's got no socks on. Maybe it's, National No Sock Day. And of course the trouble is you've lost your focus on what you're trying to do at the interview, which is find out information about whether or not this person is going to be right for the job, and instead you're focusing on something else. So job seekers among you, please wear socks when you go to your interviews.
Like
so
you remembered him.
Well, you do. The trouble is you do remember them, but for all the wrong reasons. Because if you say, well, did he get the job? Of course he didn't get the job. That's the trouble. These things are very, very, very powerful. There's also, if you use scoring, so particularly public sector, but lots of other organisations, if they do structure their interviews, so you say there's these 5 things I want to test for in my interview, so I write my headline questions, and then at the end, particularly if it's a panel interview, we all score and see how people have done. You do get this tendency with scoring systems, we see it a lot in appraisal as well, to kind of score in the middle. There's sort of a natural tendency to want to think, well, that particularly in recruitment, you don't really know them, so you're not going to give them a 5 necessarily, but you don't want to think too badly of them, and so you kind of see a lot of kind of 3s everywhere, and the scoring process kind of becomes a bit daft, really. So you need to think about how you define the scoring process, and you need to make that a very robust process to avoid those kinds of things. The other one that crops up a lot is contrast effect. So contrasting them with the person who last had the job, for example. Well, they're not going to be as good as so-and-so who's just left us. And if you remember at the beginning we said, do we really need to replace so-and-so directly? So it might not be a very useful comparison to make. So there are several kind of difficulties with assessing the evidence that you get from an interview. I've got red going on here. Let's go for just a couple of words on psychometrics. They're becoming a little bit more commonplace these days. There are a couple of different types. So there are what we call ability tests. So if you want to test for maths or English or do a technical test of some kind, there are those sorts of tests that are pretty easily available, and most of them you can get a norm for the UK, so you can do things like set marks, so that if the maths is a requirement for the job, you're only going to see the people that get 75% on the test or whatever it might be. So they can be quite useful to help screen out the people who've really got the skills. Then you have the personality profile type tests. There are a couple of types, but the one that we prefer using is where the results that the person gives are normed against the UK population. So if you remember at school you did, height of the UK population, some people are very short, some people are very tall, but most of us are somewhere in the middle, where you get exactly the same norm tables for personality profiles. So you're not saying, so the results aren't good or bad, they're just saying how like somebody is to, I don't know, how warm they are, how gregarious they are, whatever the test might be about, compared with the norm in the UK population. So if you want very outgoing people to do a particular role, and you want to see whether actually their normal profile, their personality profile, is to be more outgoing, more gregarious, more bubbly than the norm in the UK population, they can be quite a good way of assessing things like that. But again, you should never make a recruitment decision solely on the test, and you need to make sure that you are testing for things that are relevant to the job that's being done. Otherwise there are risks of unfairness there. I've talked a little bit about assessment centres already, and often you use the personality profiles in the assessment centres. The big issue with personality profiles is they're not a magic answer to why can't I recruit the right people. That they just don't work in that way, and often managers get a bit hoodwinked into thinking that you've kind of got the result. But there are so many things that impact on whether somebody is warm and bubbly in your organisation compared to where they were in the past, that they're not a sort of magic bullet, but they can be a very useful way of getting some extra information into the recruitment decision. And then just a few things in terms of, you know, having recruited somebody. I'm sure the job seekers here will tell you that one of their big gripes is that they never hear from the organisation if they've been for an interview and they don't get it. And it's still a massive problem. I know administratively it can be quite a big issue, but actually, if you remember, we said, you know, coming for an interview is a bit of a two-way street. It's a bit of a PR opportunity as well as being a recruitment opportunity, and just sending a note back to somebody to say they didn't get the job is absolutely the right way. One of the reasons we often don't do it is we're worried that we'll be asked why. Why didn't you give me the job? And again, if you've asked a lot of hypothetical questions and you don't have very much information, you might be worried about answering that question. If you've got specifics from their experience against the specifics required from the job, it's really easy to say, well, do you remember we talked about decision making or running a project and these things, and you gave me these examples and they didn't quite match what we do here, and other candidates have better examples of those. That's a sort of acceptable conversation that somebody who's been to you and been for an interview can understand that A, you listened and took note, and B, they really genuinely don't quite match the profile. So again, using those sort of behavioural techniques can be really good. Make sure that you have contracts that you send out people with their job offers. Have them drafted so you can send them out with the offer. People know all the terms and conditions at the point at which they start. It doesn't mean you can't have probationary periods and so on. You can write all that into your contracts. References is becoming a bit of a difficult issue. Increasingly, you're getting almost nothing back, but we would still recommend taking out references on the people that you employ, one of which should be a work reference, as to both of them being personal references. Medical assessments. If you have jobs that require people, maybe they're very physical jobs, or to do a particular job they mustn't have a particular medical qualification, you need to do a medical assessment on them to make that decision, otherwise you risk potentially running over disability discrimination. And you should ideally do that test once you've narrowed it down to the person that you would really like to take on, and not before. So you narrow it down to the person that you'd really like to take on, and then if it's an absolute requirement for the role, at that point they go for their medicals, and only if they fail that medical would they then not get the full job offer. It's not enough to make assumptions about somebody's medical condition. You really need to have a proper medical assessment. You can withdraw offers. Clients often get a bit worried about it. The reason we like to send the contract out with the job offer is you can say in your contract that it's subject to satisfactory references, for example, and if you get unsatisfactory references, you can withdraw the job offer. You can say in your contract that it's subject to them passing the medicals or whatever it might be, and if they don't pass the medicals, you can withdraw the job offer. You can have, if you want, 0 notice in the first month, so that if you withdraw the job offer at some point, there's no question that somebody's going to be entitled to notice and so on. Have a good induction process. Often that gets forgotten. We put a lot of effort and energy into doing the actual recruitment. But what we also need to do is to make sure that we introduce and induct people properly into the organisation. And most organisations these days use probationary periods. We would recommend doing it. It's a good thing for that first 3 months to be about you getting used to them getting used to your way of working. Have the right in the contract to extend that probationary period as well, because there are times where you might not be quite sure, you don't want to get rid of them straight away, and you can extend the probationary period if you need to. Just a little conscious on time, but in terms of recruitment, I don't know whether there are any particular questions that people have.
Few comments and questions. One of them is related to the Equality Act. Just a clarification that actually there are 3 other protected characteristics that you didn't mention, which is gender reassignment, pregnancy and maternity, and civil partnership and marriage. And I just think that it's important to mention because a lot of employers actually forget about them.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely
yes,
right.
And in relation to the Equality Act, I just wanted to ask you about your thought on positive action, or just to explain a bit for 2 candidates, for example, where they have equal merit. Would you actually go for the candidate who obviously has a particular characteristics that you might not have in your organization, or it's underrepresented? Because obviously the law actually allows you to do that, but a lot of people actually confuse the positive action with positive discrimination and actually hire somebody just because of one specific particular characteristic, for example, if they're black, for example. So I just wanted to ask you whether, how would you actually approach the issue with positive action, and how would you communicate it properly in order to make sure that employers or your managers don't actually apply a positive discrimination as opposed to action. And then you were also talking about the recruitment process. It was just great the way you explained it. And when you were talking about thinking about the right attitude of candidates, and this is a way of actually selecting the best person for the job, I was just wondering, because it's about recruitment but also retention, it's worth mentioning something around what we do in order to retain this good pool of candidates within our workforce. So I would appreciate if you could give us a few thoughts on that, or a few tips of how to retain and how to motivate staff, how to engage them really. In terms of the sourcing candidates, my personal observation is that LinkedIn is quite a good forum of finding the right pool of candidates, just because, first of all, it gives you references, because a lot of candidates actually have their references from previous employers. So obviously you can easily have a look at them, and you can be sure actually that they're not sort of fake, for example. So LinkedIn seems to be quite a good network of finding your candidates, advertising your posts, obviously, and it's quite cheap, probably. You would probably say better than me, but if you used it as an employer, probably it would be quite cheap way of using it. Obviously, it's not the only way of advertising your posts, but again, it's about how you find the right candidates. And the last thing around the psychometric testing, from what I've seen so far, usually it's used as a way of shortlisting candidates to the interview process. So basically it's actually the other way around. Employers, especially in private sector, probably our colleague might tell us about us more, they actually do the psychometric testing first, so that you can select a certain pool and actually reduce the number of candidates drastically, which I think is fair enough, but then we have to also take into account the fact that people with disabilities, for example, dyslexia or other problems, might be discriminated against. So I would be very concerned when I use such a psychometric testing. So again, it should be very relevant to the job, and it should provide you with an opportunity to actually provide justifiable adjustments, which is something also covered by legislation. So thank you. Hopefully this is something that you might be able to comment on. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of positive action, my view is that that's for different organisations to set their policy on that. We work mainly with smaller and medium-sized companies, and I have to say it's fairly rare that they have two people who are absolutely equal in terms of all the factors that they've looked at. And particularly if you use the kind of episodic questioning, because you get very different experience from one candidate to another. And so you're usually able to say, what's the more relevant experience to this organisation? And that will vary so much from company to company or organisation to organisation, because what suits one company just won't suit somebody else. So my experience is that it's pretty rare. And often where people say, oh, I've got two very the same, it's because they've asked a lot of hypothetical questions actually, and they don't have a lot of data from the candidates. Because if you ask real questions about real experience, the results you get are so different that it's difficult to say they're exactly the same. But certainly for bigger organisations, we would recommend having some policy around that, so that you know, but they need good statistics. How many of our clients have good statistics on who's underrepresented in the workforce? Not that many. So you need good data first to start making those kinds of decisions, and to have some policy on it as well, so you get consistency across the organisation. Otherwise you get managers in part of the organisation making decisions in one direction, and managers in another part of the organisation making decisions in other directions.
Discriminating.
Yeah. Possibly discriminating, or possibly, you know, being, the other thing is being worried about not seen to be discriminating, so saying that there are two candidates who are kind of the same when actually they might not be, but they're so worried about making that error that they go down that particular route. So certainly in our client base, it's a very individualistic approach down to the circumstances of their business. I wouldn't have, you know, a best practice model that I think all companies should adopt. So I don't think it's the way to go. In terms of motivating staff, I have got a few things to say. I don't know whether we're taking a coffee break or whether you want me to plough straight on, but we are. Okay, so I might, if you're able to stay, come to that. Then LinkedIn is certainly, you're absolutely right, LinkedIn is a good source of people. I'm not so sure that you can absolutely rely on what people say about themselves, but it is a good source of finding people, and I've certainly used it to good effect where somebody has struggled, because at the moment, if people are in good jobs, they want to stay in good jobs, and they're less likely to look outside their organisation unless they're disgruntled. And so I have used it recently in a couple of pieces of recruitment where we've actively needed to go and target people in competitor organisations and try and entice people into my client. And LinkedIn has been a very good source for that, or getting recommendations from somebody I do know about somebody else I ought to talk to. So LinkedIn is certainly worth using. Using psychometric tests first, I think you're right, there's a potential trap in that, and I would only do that where an organisation has got good data and research to show that the psychometric things they're measuring are directly related to success and the requirements of the job. And if you could show that, like you can with an ability test, you know, it's a job that needs a certain level of English or a certain level of maths, or in my IT client, you know, a certain level of SQL, SQL Server, whatever that is, then for ability it's really easy to say, if they haven't got the SQL Server skills, we don't want to interview them. So we need to test that first. With personality it's a little bit different. And so we would tend to use personality profiles either as part of an assessment centre, so that we make the decision with that information but not only on that information, or after the interviewing process when we've got down to a shortlist, and not first. But I know there are some big organisations who can afford Savile and Holdsworth to do the research for them, for example. So I know, for instance, that Tesco's used to, I don't know if they still use it, but they used to use a customer service adapted personality profile that they had properly researched, properly normed, and that's what everybody had to pass. I remember doing it, I did my training and failing miserably. And that's fine if you've got the results to show that success in the test equals success in the job. And that's absolutely key. Yes, and as I say, the motivation stuff I'm happy to come on to afterwards. Just to say a few things then on once you've recruited people, trying to manage them and retain them in some form within the organisation. So the first thing really to think about is where people management sits in terms of your thinking about the business. You know, is it up there with how you manage the finances of your business, how you manage how well your business interacts with its clients, how effective it is, for example? Is it up there with how well you manage your stakeholder or your shareholders' requirements and so on? So we would obviously, being HR consultants, say that pretty much it should be up there in terms of your thinking with the things like how you financially manage the business or how you manage the customer service in your business and so on, because it is pretty much, for most businesses, the people that deliver what you do. And then overall, it's worth thinking about, you know, what is your working environment like? Is it a nice place to come? Is it a nice place to work? Or is it something different? Now, maybe you don't have to be quite as funky as this, but environment has a big impact on people's feeling of well-being and happiness at work. And that's not just the people that they interact with, although that's a very important part, but the actual physical environment. I remember going into a client many years ago. We do some climate surveys to work out, you know, how motivated and your workforce are. And one of the first things I did, so they got me in to sort of talk about it, and one of the first, I went to the loo, sort of arrived, got out of the car, a little bit later than me, went to the loo, and the hot water in the gents didn't work. And I said to the client, you can do all the climate surveys you want, but let's fix the hot water in the gents, right? Because it doesn't say very much about how much you value your staff when they can't wash their hands after they've been to the loo. So the environment that you're in says an awful lot about what your employer is like and how much they value the people inside their organisation. And all of my other comments really are kind of supportive of that kind of thing. So what do your staff want? Well, I guess money's up there somewhere. In most of our climate surveys and things that we do, it's probably not in the top 5. It's in the top 5 if you've got it wrong. If you've got your pay policy wrong, then it's usually right up there. It's probably somewhere in the top 10. But actually there are lots of other things that people really value. So this sense of satisfaction, of knowing when you've done a good job. You know, how many organisations do we walk into and people, you know, one of the biggest gripes people have is that they're told about things that go wrong, but never about things that go really well. There's never that sense of celebrating and sharing in the organisation's success. It doesn't have to cost buckets of money, but it's a real motivator for many people wanting to be part of a successful organisation, particularly, as I say, in current times. People don't want to move from organisations where they're doing well, where they feel comfortable. So as well as being part of a successful organisation, they want to feel that in some way they're protected from failure. They want to feel valued in what they do. More and more they want flexibility. Although in current economic climate there seems to be fewer and fewer requests for flexibility, but you know, there's an increasing amount of that around, partly driven by legislation. So the right to request flexible working if you have a dependent, and so on. But partly also driven by more modern lifestyle, where people want a bit more control over what they do. In fact, control is a very important word when it comes to motivation. The more people feel they have some control over their work, often the more motivated that they are. And some fair differentials. So that's the other time money kind of hits the top 5 when we do some research, is where people might not feel that they're on the wrong salary, but they feel that the differentials between them and the next level up, or them and the next level down, or them and across, or whatever, they feel that those things aren't fair. So a performance management approach, just quickly say something on that in terms of motivating your people and retaining your people. Some of these elements, I guess, are fairly self-explanatory. Training is often up there in terms of what people value. Being trained and stretched to do new things, learn new skills, it's really up there, and it's an important part of the mix, even now in times where budgets are tight. Finding ways of training and developing people is really important. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive course. Getting them involved in a project they'd really like to be involved in, or where they meet new customers or do new things, can be just as powerful as sending somebody off, and often more powerful than sending somebody off on a course. Having something to say about career development and succession in your organisation, for many people, that's really up there in terms of what motivates them. You know, wanting to see that they're not just going to come in at this entry level and stay there. Some people want to do that, but many people want to see some progression, some ability. Now that can be hard in smaller organisations, but it's still potentially possible to do. So take this IT company, for example, that I've been working with. 30, 35 people. It's not a big organisation, but we have created some career paths for our implementers, for example, our implementation team. So we've got some development for them. And we've also, with the help desk team, which is another difficult area to fill, we've been able to give them some additional responsibilities and some additional work that they do that takes them out of the help desk for a couple of days a week and off doing some other stuff that they're really interested in. And for me, there's probably not much more we can do there, because we kind of hit that ceiling where, you know, there are only so many roles. But just finding those things can really help in terms of career development. And then I'll talk a little bit more about reward. There's all sorts of theories of motivation. I quite like this one because it seems to work for me. This idea of motivation calculus. So just very quickly, the end is about meeting the needs of your people. So for those of you who've done Maslow, it might be the Maslow factors, it might be the money, it might be the flexibility, it might be the status of working with a particular client, it might be that they can clock off at 4. It's meeting those people's needs as far as you can within the working environment. Being able to give some flexibility to go off and do a dentist appointment or whatever, providing it's not disruptive. So one angle on motivation is meeting those needs insofar as you can inside the organisation. The difficulty, of course, is everybody's needs are different. This is the other important bit about motivation. How will I know when I get there? It's often missing from things like bonus schemes. How will I know when my bonus will get triggered? So the results piece is really important in motivating people behind a particular piece of work or behind doing something. You know, if you've ever launched an appraisal scheme inside your organisation and found that 12 months later it's sitting dusty in somebody's desk, one of the reasons is that nobody really understands what's the benefit, what's the result of doing all that work for me as a manager or for the organisation or for me as the employee. So being really clear about what the results are going to be, saying how you're going to measure them, is a really important bit of the motivation calculus, of working out what motivates and what doesn't motivate people. And then this is the other calculation that we do, don't we? We say, is it worth it to me personally? If I put in all this effort now and work all these long hours, is it going to be worth it to me? And again, the problem with this in terms of thinking about motivation is the answer is different for probably almost every single person in your organisation. But that's what we do. It's kind of a human thing to say, well, you know, it's not that I don't like the results. It's not that I wouldn't like the £5,000 bonus, but is it really worth it to me to put that stuff in? And that's, again, often with bonus schemes that people put in to retain people and motivate, it's a problem. I went into an organisation a couple of years ago, and they said to me, well, when you're talking to these people, will you talk to them about this new wonderful bonus we've put in, because it's not working. And the problem with the bonus was it had a clawback thing in it. So they'd done all this stuff about, well, we don't want to pay at the end of the year because that won't motivate people. But then, of course, what they'd done is they put in this clawback system because they were really, really worried that people were going to earn more bonus than they really should. And of course, people did this calculation. Is it really worth me busting my gut this month and I might get a clawback next month? And I don't have much control over the results. And that was really key. And so people weren't bothering with the bonus scheme. They just earn my basic salary. Thank you very much. So the effort bit of motivating people, is it worth it to people, is really quite important. And quite often I take out bonus schemes and put the money in a salary pot and redo how we do salaries, because actually what you get out of the bonus is so meaningless to those people that there's no point having the scheme in the first place. We might as well spend the money on training or spend it in the salary pot or do something else with it. Oops. So then there's this big question of whether money motivates, and what does the research say? Well, it says that if you have simple tasks, things that repeat over and over, or piecework type tasks with easily measurable results, money often works. So often in factory jobs, for example, in sales jobs it often works, where there is a process I go through to get the sale, I can measure that result, it works. But actually, once you get beyond that, once you get into more complex tasks, once you get into harder to measure results, maybe team effort rather than individual effort to get the result out at the end, the research shows that money doesn't really motivate. That you should treat it like a hygiene factor. In other words, you should take it off the table as a gripe and a moan and a groan. You should have a pay policy that pays people a reasonable salary for what they do. It's not they wouldn't take more money if you offered it to them, but that it's just not that much of an issue to them, and there are things that might be far more important. You know, why do people do voluntary work? Why do they do all this stuff and get no money? Because they're getting something else out of doing the work that goes beyond the money, and that's just as true when people are employed and when they're employed to do things that go beyond simple, easily measurable tasks. Money often isn't a great motivator. I guess I've touched on a few of these, but in terms of some of the pitfalls of the scheme, so if people put in reward schemes or bonus schemes or commission schemes, one of the big downers is making the scheme far too complicated, far too difficult for people to work out how they control it, how they earn money out of it, too many ifs and buts in a scheme, and that's often a circumstance where we would take the scheme out and do something else with the pot of money. If it's going to be motivational, it needs to be relatively straightforward, it needs to be a meaningful outcome, it needs to be easy for people to see when and how they're going to earn some money. Often bonus schemes, reward schemes, incentive schemes are kind of stretched focused. So stretching the individual, stretching the team, stretching the business to go beyond a good result this year and get an excellent result this year. We've just done some work for an organisation looking at their incentive plans, and this has become a real problem because in the current market, through no fault of most of the people in the organisation, the stretch is now absolutely impossible. And because everybody knows it's impossible, it's just not been kind of said, the incentive plan no longer incentivises, because it just wouldn't, it's back to that effort thing, it just wouldn't be worth it, you just couldn't do it. And so there are times when that stretch goal or stretch target becomes impossible to achieve, and you don't get enough reward for what is seen as far too much effort. The other thing to be careful about is what effect putting in a bonus scheme or a reward scheme or a commission scheme might have on your culture. So putting in very individualistic type schemes where you've got a very team-orientated culture, or you need teams of people to work together across the business, causes all sorts of problems about, I gave that department this sale but I don't get anything for it, and all this kind of stuff. So you need to design something that fits the kind of culture that you want to have inside your organisation. So if it's team effort that drives it, you need to have things that, that drive the team to cooperate, to work together. We put in place a couple of years ago a very good scheme. We swapped an individual bonus scheme for a team sharing the success of the organisation type scheme, where they kind of get a pseudo profit share, and that's been much better. Even in the years when they haven't earned very much out of it, you can still have a good conversation about the effort and about what we're going to do together as a team next year, rather than focusing on individual results. There are lots of things you can do on a shoestring without a lot of money. And these often come up in our climate survey. Being told thank you, being sent out with my husband for a meal, being whatever. So sometimes these small things that you can do, which don't cost the business very much money, have high impact for people in your organisation, and are really valued in the organisation. Even down to, you know, we've had organisations that say, well, you know, you've done a great job for us over the years, you're suddenly having to go into hospital for this surgery, you couldn't have foreseen it, we of course can just pay you SSP, but we're going to pay you your full pay. And stuff like that gets remembered and can be really valued. So that sort of flexibility to think a bit differently and do things a bit differently for people can really work. The opportunities to develop, to learn new skills. Again, very often that doesn't mean necessarily sending them out on a course. There's lots of things that can be done inside the organisation, and you know, finding ways to put the fun back into work and catching people doing stuff right. It can have a big impact on the team if you move from always finding the faults to actually starting to catch them do something right. And then just very quickly, in terms of a slightly different approach, although the two can be complementary, which is more around talent. So rather than just thinking about performance of the people in your organisation, you can think about defining what talent might be in your organisation. What are the talents that people have that could transform the organisation from doing an okay job or providing an okay service to doing something better? And proactively developing the talents in your organisation. And again, we typically use a kind of competency type approach, because very often it isn't so much the knowledge and skills they have, it's how they do that, it's how they deploy that inside the organisation. So if you've put together some competencies for your recruitment, it doesn't have to stop there. You can start thinking about using them from a development point of view to develop the talented people in your organisation. And you know, in these days of no hierarchies and very flat structures and not much money, there are lots of ways that you can describe what that looks like and start to describe career paths in ways that might be quite exciting for the people in your organisation, but don't necessarily rely on getting a promotion every 6 months and getting more money. So this is one I did for a particular organisation. The words kind of reflect that organisation, so it might not be suitable for you. But we kind of created these sort of things that the three key teams in the business, what were they doing? What are the talents they had to give to the business and develop inside the business? And it made much more sense to them than going through the typical kind of appraisal approach. You know, these were the key talents that people needed to develop in order to do well in whatever stream, whatever team they were inside the organisation. These were the focuses that people had to have. And we recruited against this model, but we also developed talented people against this model. We recognised the talent and we developed it. We did quite a lot of work as well buddying people up. So if we had somebody who was really great at developing the creative environment within the organisation, wanted to pass some of that on and outwards into the team, we did a lot of sort of buddying up. To focus on developing the talents we need in the team rather than just performance managing people for the sake of it. It gives you a slightly different approach and a different feel to what you're doing. And this is just one way that it could look. There's loads and loads of ways. And then if you do that kind of thing, you can take stock in lots of ways. So you can use competencies and the talent matrix that you create in the appraisals. You can get client feedback into it, which people quite like a lot. So it's not just my manager's view, but I work really well with these clients. So we can put that sort of feedback in. And you can also then do results across the team. So with the organisation, you've just seen their talent matrix model. We actually did an audit across the team of where those talents lies and where the gaps were in their organisation. What were the bits that they were missing or had very little of and needed more of? And that enabled us, when we came to recruitment, to be clear that we were looking for something different because we wanted to fill those particular gaps. So you can start to do something quite more creative with that kind of approach. And it works across both taking stock individually, but also looking at your team and looking at who you've got in your team and the talents within your team. If you do take this approach, though, you do need to do things that you might not typically do in the organisation. So you do need to be good at giving feedback, to be good at coaching people and bringing people on, to have some space for some development and some career opportunity in the organisation, for example, and make it clear to people what the path to that is. To involve people more, it tends to imply that they're a bit more involved in their own development, involved in their understanding of the organisation, a bit more involved in their understanding of how they contribute to the organisation. So that kind of talent approach tends to need slightly different tools and different practices maybe than a standard performance management approach. But it can be a much more creative way of thinking about how you motivate, how do you develop, how do you keep talented people. And these are just some of the ways then you can farm it out in terms of linking it to lots of other things that you do in the organisation. And then really just thinking about, as I say, once you've got those matrix, how you fill the gaps. Do you recruit it in? Do you outsource part of it? Because actually you've realised that although it's a talent you need, it's not something that's very core. It kind of opens up lots of other opportunities then for how you might fill some of those gaps. So I just want to keep us to getting some lunch for 12:15. So I've kind of whizzed through them a little bit, but hopefully that kind of gives you some feeling in terms of the motivation side of the equation. And again, any questions before we take a break?
No. I think it's a wonderful talk, and you answered all the questions inside. I must say it's a very complete and comprehensive talk, and you left probably no area uncovered. Just a comment, not a question. I've been recruiting for my 3 businesses for the last 2 years, and I found that the structured interview has given me a more stable staff as compared to a subjective interview, especially when I had so many CVs, good CVs. I had to pick one right person, 2 people. The structured interview really gave me the right approach. It just takes away the mood of the interviewer, the little variations between 2 people, a bad telephone call, some stress on the mind.
Absolutely.
A structured interview takes care of all these factors, which are human factors. So you score ability, experience, person walking in, persona, and all the things, and give them numbers out of 10. And then the people who scored, let's say 60 out of 100, that person gets the job, the rest are less than 60, for instance.
Yeah.
This is just a comment, but this is my view that I found this very useful.
Yeah, good.